On February 18, 2024, Russia achieved its biggest ground-based victory in Ukraine in over 9 months. It finally took Avdiivka. Russian troops stormed the city in an operation that had been planned and in place since October 2023, eventually wearing down Ukrainian resistance to the point where Zelensky's troops were forced to withdraw. Running low on ammo and artillery, Ukraine had to make a terrible sacrifice to save its troops from being surrounded, overwhelmed, and put to the Russian sword. And in making that sacrifice, it may have just handed Russia the key to winning the war. The Russian state television quickly broadcast images that would put a smile on Vladimir Putin's face. Images of the iconic blue and yellow of Ukraine's flag, so long a symbol of resistance for the embattled country, being torn down, were beamed throughout Moscow. And in their place was the white, blue, and red of Russia, raised all over the city, including over its pivotal coke plant. Russia propaganda was in full force following the victory. Though Ukraine's military said its withdrawal was well organized, resulting in minimal casualties, Russia painted a different picture. It talked of troops in disarray, terrified of the mighty Russian advance, rushing to get out of the city before they were killed or captured. Make no mistake about it, taking Avdiivka was a major victory for Russia and Putin. But why? And what does the loss of this major city mean for Ukraine as it continues to fight against Putin's seemingly relentless horde of invaders? To answer that question, we first need to explore Avdiivka and what makes it so special, both as a symbol to Ukraine and as a military target for Russia. Nestled in the center of the Donetsk Oblast, a term used to denote an administrative region in the former Soviet Union, Avdiivka is a small city. Before Russia's invasion, it was home to around 30,000 people in 2022, though this number fell dramatically after Putin's invasion. By October 2023, when Putin launched his assault on the city in earnest, the population had dropped to just 1,600. Just weeks later, it was reported to be around 1,000, most living below ground level, to either avoid the fighting or conduct assaults on Russian troops. Yet, despite the small stature, Avdiivka has always been an important city in Ukraine for a simple reason. It's home to the country's largest coke plant. Before you get images of some sort of illicit drug trade in your mind, a coke plant is responsible for transforming coal into the coke needed to make steel within a blast furnace. The coke serves a dual purpose. It offers the heat required to melt the ore used to make the steel, and it serves as an oxygen thief by pulling all the oxygen out of the ore to leave only the pure iron needed to make the steel behind. That plant hasn't exactly been operational since the start of the war, but it was something of a symbol to Ukraine. An element of their industrial strength has now been snatched away from them in a move severely dampening the country's morale. Russia knows this, which is why it made such a big deal about raising its flag over the coke plant. By taking that plant, Russia has struck a huge blow against Ukraine and its image of itself. What's more, if Russia wins the war outright, which is looking increasingly likely, it'll have a major industrial asset that could fuel further war efforts. But it's not just the coke plant that makes Avdiivka so important. It's the city's tactical position. Back in 2014, a group of Moscow-sponsored separatists captured Avdiivka in a move that can now be seen as an omen of what was to come 8 years later. Ukraine responded to that group's efforts, which saw it take large portions of eastern Ukraine with force, eventually taking the city back before building fortifications to prevent a similar event from happening again. The city became a fortress, littered with a network of concrete bunkers and tower blocks that give occupying troops a huge advantage over the invaders. Avdiivka was seen as a city that simply couldn't be stormed without the invading party experiencing massive losses. Plus, the coke plant mentioned earlier wasn't just one of Europe's top coke producers, it also served as a weapons depot and a military base during the war. In taking the city, Russia now has control of territory it can fortify with more troops than Ukraine was capable of leaving to defend the city. A counteroffensive could now be out of the question. After all, if Avdiivka was so difficult to take for the larger and better-equipped Russian army, it'll be doubly harder to retake for the Ukrainian forces that are struggling to find the munitions they need to defend their territory, much less launch a full-scale counteroffensive. For Russia, taking Avdiivka also means they're protecting themselves. Many see the city as the gateway into the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, over which it's maintained unsteady control of since the attacks by Moscow-sponsored separatist groups in 2014. These are territories that the United States, along with much of the Western world, recognize as belonging to Ukraine. But during Putin's war, they've been used as launching points for many Russian attacks, with the assault and eventual capture of Avdiivka being among the most significant. Now with the city under their control, Russia has something important in place: a barrier between the territory it currently controls and the parts of Ukraine it aims to take. To reclaim the Donetsk and Luhansk oblasts, Ukraine will first likely have to retake Avdiivka, overcoming the very fortifications it put in place to defend the city. For Russia, Avdiivka represents control over a major supply road, increased safety for the regions it already controls, and if used well, a route into other major Ukrainian cities. All of this leads to another question: how was Avdiivka captured? After all, the city was fortified to prevent the situation. So what did Russia do to allow it to overcome the Ukrainian defense finally? The answer is vital, because it might indicate the tactics Russia will use when attacking Ukrainian territory in the future. According to Al Jazeera, forming a pincer around the city formed the crux of Moscow's strategy. By October 2023, Russia had forces stationed in Avdiivka's north and south, attacking simultaneously. Those troops forced Ukraine to defend the city on two fronts. As soon as the northern attack was repelled, more troops would come from the south. A battle of attrition started, with Avdiivka essentially being cut off of support, while Putin threw soldiers and munitions at the city at a startling rate. The 4 months of fighting took a massive toll on Ukraine's forces. Alexander Tarnovskaya, the commander of Ukraine's Tavria forces, put the losses into context. He said that the attempted defense of Avdiivka led to 47,000 Ukrainian casualties, along with the loss of crucial military assets. Russia managed to destroy 364 tanks, 748 armored fighting vehicles, and 248 artillery systems in its assault. Among the Ukrainian losses were also 5 aircraft, and it was in the aerial battle Russia finally found the key to unlock Avdiivka's defensive doors. After spending months battering away at Avdiivka's defenses, Russian forces finally attained air superiority. That, according to Washington's Institute for the Study of War, or ISW, allowed Moscow to support its ground troops. As the think tank puts it, Russian planes were able to provide ground troops with close air support during the final days of their offensive operation. That opinion is backed up by Sergei Shoigu, Russia's defense minister, who claims that Russia conducted 450 precise airstrikes in the last days of the campaign. Most of those strikes used glide bombs, which are unpowered munitions fitted with fins that allow them to glide further than typical inertial bombs. According to one Ukrainian soldier, 60 of these glide bombs were sent flying on February 17th alone. Ukraine responded, of course. It claims that it managed to shoot down 7 Russian planes in just 5 days once the glide bomb offensive was launched, including 4 Sukhoi 34 and 3 Sukhoi 35 fighters. But it just wasn't enough. The constant bombardment of ground troops supported by glide bombs, along with the clever pincer movement Russia put in place, meant that Moscow ultimately had more resources than Ukrainian troops defending Avdiivka. The city fell. According to the New York Times, Russia captured up to 1,000 Ukrainian troops when taking the city. But even more worryingly, it had established that it could essentially starve out Ukrainian forces through sheer numbers by cutting off supply lines and executing a pincer movement backed by air superiority once it had worn down Avdiivka's defenses. All of this brings us to a pivotal question. What does the loss of Avdiivka really mean for Ukraine? In the immediate sense, Russia has established an approach it'll likely implement in other Ukrainian cities. Whether that approach will work in other attacks remains to be seen. According to Al Jazeera, Russian forces ramped up assaults on other cities, both during the final stages of its assault on Avdiivka and in the days following its success. Liman and Kupiansk, both eastern cities, are believed by some observers to be Moscow's next targets. We'll likely see those two cities being subjected to the same ongoing bombardments, coupled with pincer movements that crippled Avdiivka. Ukrainian positions on the left bank of the Dnipro River might also come under attack, especially now that Russia can free up some of the resources it used in the Avdiivka offensive and divert them elsewhere. But there is a ray of hope for Ukraine here. Russia may struggle to advance further from Avdiivka for now. The ISW points this out, saying Ukrainian forces have long fortified many of the surrounding settlements, which Russian forces are also struggling to capture. What it leaves out is that Russia now controls a major city that it can use as a base from which to bombard those settlements. The resources it used to take Avdiivka have now been freed up, perhaps to be used in the fortified areas surrounding the city. And with Avdiivka captured, Russia now has a point through which it can funnel more troops from the Donetsk region that it already controls, bringing its superior numbers to bear on these fortified settlements in the process. Putin likely believes these settlements will fall in due time. He's probably right. and that's what's led some to speculate that Russia has turned the tide of this war against Ukraine. The BBC points out that taking the city was Russia's most significant victory in the war since it managed to repel Ukraine's counteroffensive in 2023. But more worryingly, it's a sign that Russia can simply throw sheer numbers at Ukraine to overwhelm its defenses. The news outlet highlights Russia's population of 144 million, 3 times that of Ukraine. Digging deeper, Global Firepower says that Russia has 420,000 more people in its active military and 800,000 more reserve troops. Keeping with the BBC's numbers, it also says that Russia has approximately 3 times the amount of available manpower, as well as triple the number of people who are fit for service, and 798,919 people reaching military age every year, compared to 476,371 for Ukraine. In short, size matters. Major Rodion Kudryashov of the Ukrainian 3rd Assault Brigade that was stationed in Avdiivka highlights this problem when speaking to the BBC. He claimed that Russian troops outnumbered his forces 7-1, concluding that the battle was like fighting 2 armies. While Kudryashov seemed confident that Russia wouldn't be capable of pushing on and taking other cities, such as Pokrovsk, the reality may be that cities like that will be subjected to the same type of pincer movement tactics. All of this is good news for Russia. Moscow is finally seeing its numbers advantage come to bear, and it couldn't have come at a better time for one man, Vladimir Putin. This is a man who is determined to keep power. And with state media reporting 80% approval ratings, the taking of Avdiivka will only bolster that popularity, serving as proof that Putin's claims that Russia will win this war are coming true. The point is, Russia has a major propaganda victory now to bolster Putin and his troops' morale. And morale is going to be a problem for Ukraine as the war goes on. While Putin is sitting pretty thanks to taking Avdiivka, Ukraine's morale might start to crumble. That's exactly what Putin wants, and it's a tactic that Russia has used before. That's the opinion of Seth G. Jones, who's an analyst with the Washington Center for Strategic and International Studies. Speaking to the Wall Street Journal, he points out that the tactics Russia used in Avdiivka mirror those that they used in Syria, Chechnya, and Afghanistan. Jones calls it a textbook punishment campaign, and the idea is simple. Continue to raise the societal costs of war to push a country's population and military closer to giving up. The state of Avdiivka showcases what the campaign looks like. The city is a shadow of its former self, being little more than an array of bombed-out buildings requiring extensive rebuilding should Ukraine win the war. Even the coke plant, such an important propaganda piece for Russia, has been rendered inoperable throughout the war, stripping Ukraine of a vital source of income. Every bombardment of a city by Russia in the future will carry the same message: give up now, or we will leave another of your cities in ruin. And some reports suggest that that tactic is working. The New York Times reports that Ukraine is having to resort to some underhanded tactics to convince or perhaps coerce some young Ukrainians to sign up for the military. It claims recruiters are confiscating passports to prevent potential soldiers from escaping the conflict, as well as snatching people up from their jobs to move them to the front lines. In one case, according to the New York Times, recruiters even attempted to send a man who had mental disabilities into military training. Business Insider also builds on these reports, with claims that recruiters from the Ukrainian city of Kitsman are building a local reputation as people snatchers for their over-the-top methods of trying to bring more people into Ukraine's army. The Center for European Policy Analysis, or CEPA, further highlights Ukraine's problem. It reports that Ukraine's parliament attempted to introduce a mobilization law toward the end of 2023, though that law faced fierce opposition from the country's opposing political parties. A modified draft of the law has now been accepted, still facing opposition, that will lower the age for mandatory military service from 27 to 25. The law would also force every Ukrainian man between 18 and 60 years of age to set up an electronic account on the military sign-up website, confirming they're a potential recruit and putting them in line to receive call-up letters. Ukraine will impose sanctions on anyone who refuses the call. It all paints a picture of a country struggling to find the manpower needed to battle against Russia's relentless offensive. As highlighted earlier, part of the issue lies in the fact that Russia simply has more soldiers. But Ukraine's leadership also has to face the likely possibility that after over 2 years of war, its population is starting to lose its appetite for the fight. Moscow is breaking the will of Ukraine's potential soldiers, even if the country's leadership wants to continue the fight. And with its victory in Avdiivka, Russia has shown Ukraine that it can win important territory and will likely continue doing so. Perhaps it's better to submit to Putin's aggression before the entire country becomes a shell of its former self. That may be the question going through the minds of many potential recruits, leaving Ukraine's President Volodymyr Zelensky with a major morale problem on his hands as Russia keeps pressing. It all leads to a sad conclusion for Ukraine. It can no longer win the war. At least that's the opinion of Anatol Laivin, who directs the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft's Eurasia program. Writing for Time magazine, he points out that Ukraine's strategy now appears to be stay on the defensive, especially following its failed counteroffensive in 2023, hoping to wear Russia out in a long war of attrition. Let's say that strategy succeeds. Russia eventually decides to end the war. Ukraine would still have to accept that Donetsk, Avdiivka, and all the other territory that Russia claimed during the fighting would be lost. Putin will never return that territory to Ukraine if he comes to the negotiating table, meaning that even a ceasefire caused by Russia losing its appetite for its war of attrition will not mean Ukraine returns to what it once was. Having spoken to some Ukrainians in private, Laivin also points out that several agree that it's better to lose the territory Russia already claimed in return for peace. The alternative is to spend many more years fighting a bloody war that will simply continue taking a severe toll on the country. After all, its advantages are lost, argues Laivin. At the beginning of the conflict, Ukrainian troops outnumbered Russians by 3-1. That was a sign of Russian hubris. Moscow sent fewer troops than needed because it believed Ukraine would crumble. It didn't. As Putin realized he needed more, he drew from the near-endless stock of manpower he had to reverse the situation to the point where Russian troops now outnumber Ukrainian troops inside Ukraine by at least 3-1. Russia can keep pumping more people into the country, but as we established earlier, Ukraine is facing serious problems recruiting people to match, never mind exceed Russia's numbers. So Ukraine now finds itself in a catch-22 situation. Keep fighting, perhaps for years, and lose more territory, more people, more of what Ukraine is to Russia, or submit now, surrendering the territory already lost in the process to achieve a peace that ultimately amounts to a Russian victory. There's one man who isn't ready for either eventuality just yet: Volodymyr Zelensky. On February 24, 2024, 2 years to the day that Putin launched his invasion and 6 days after the loss of Avdiivka, Zelensky took part in a ceremony at Hostomel Airport to mark the occasion. Standing around 12 miles from Kyiv, the site of Ukraine's first battle with Russia, Zelensky didn't entertain any thoughts of peace or surrender. His message was simple: Ukraine is 730 days closer to victory. In a rousing speech, Zelensky said, "Any normal person wants the war to end, but none of us will allow our Ukraine to end." He also said that any end to the war and any peace that results would have to come on Ukraine's terms. Simply put, neither of the two likelihoods for Ukraine, either a long-winded defeat to Russia or giving up the territory it has already lost, will be good enough. But Zelensky knows that Ukraine can't achieve the end of the war on its terms without help from other countries, which brings us right back to Avdiivka. In the immediate aftermath of losing the city, Zelensky was quick to point to Ukraine's supposed deficit of weapons as the chief reason why his troops couldn't withstand the Russian pincer movement. Unfortunately, keeping Ukraine in artificial deficits of weapons, particularly in deficits of artillery and long-range capabilities, allows Putin to adapt to the current intensity of the war, he claimed. Al Jazeera builds on this, pointing out that many in the country blame the stalling of $60.6 billion worth of aid to Ukraine in the U.S. Congress for emboldening Russia and allowing Putin to think that he could achieve victory in Ukraine. Perhaps they're right. Timofey Myolovanov of the Kyiv School of Economics points out that Biden's administration submitted requests for funds to send to Ukraine in the spring of 2022. But in 2023, the same administration waited until the fall, creating a delay that may have cost Ukraine dearly. Avdiivka demonstrates the cost of these political delays: human lives, lost territory, and encouraging Russia. To Myolovanov, and perhaps to Zelensky, the West's delay in sending more funds and equipment has at best prolonged the war, and at worst could be why Ukraine loses. Avdiivka is not simply another city lost. It represents so much more than that in the war between Ukraine and Russia. To Russia, it's a sign that it's winning the war of attrition. If it keeps throwing more people and artillery at its targets, it now has a tactic that it can see wears down its opposition to the point where Ukrainian morale will be so diminished that the country can't go on. But to Ukraine, the loss of Avdiivka is a reminder that the aid it's received from the West so far comes with political strings attached. It can no longer rely on unconditional support, even as it frames itself as a defender of democracy. The war isn't lost for Ukraine yet, but as Zelensky points out, Russia's taking of Avdiivka showcases how vital foreign aid will be if Ukraine is to stand any chance of repelling Russia from its borders. And if that support doesn't come, the country may find itself in a position where there's no way that it can come out of the war on the winning side. Finally, we'd like to find out what you think about Russia's taking of Avdiivka. Is it really as a significant moment for Russia as it appears to be on the surface? What about Ukraine? What does losing this heavily fortified city mean for Zelensky's plans and the war's future? Tell us what you think in the comments, and thank you for watching the video.